It's a true honor to be here, and I'm really excited. I'm going to cover a lot of ground, so beware. I'm famous for giving 6-hour talks in 20 minutes, so there's going to be a lot of material packed. Well, not that much, but well, anyway, this opening slide really kind of summarizes sort of the goal of my work, which is to say, what if we could scoop up all the world's information, all the open information around the world, and try to create essentially a sort of a fusion visualization of what's happening around the world. How does that differ, to point one of the questions earlier, what am I seeing here in Washington? How is that comparing to what someone in Chicago and San Francisco is seeing, compared to what someone else around the world is seeing? Actually, one of my recent collaborations with IRIN, which is one of the, I think it was the former news agency of the UN, we've been doing a lot about the forgotten conflicts, which is kind of this notion of all these things around the world that are happening that we've never even heard of here in the US because it's been going on for 30 years and it's, sort of people aren't interested in anymore. So this is kind of the goal, and I'm going to talk a lot about what does this mean? How do you actually do something like this? Before, just a quick aside, the work I'm actually going to talk about today, actually a few hours ago was announced by Computer World as one of the winners of their 2015 Data Editor's Choice Awards. So I'm very, very excited about this. So this kind of gives you a brief overview about the type of work that I do and who I am. Long story short, this is a fraction of it. Everything from mapping the text of Wikipedia, looking at the geography of social media, tracing the spread of ideas over books, looking at declassified State Department cables, digitizing the world's constitutions, extracting out the images of the world's books and putting those on Flickr. I tend to focus on really massive projects. How do we truly reimagine how we understand ourselves and the world around us through data? You think about today, there's just so much data out there. What can we do with this if we start thinking outside the box and thinking very creatively? And what you're seeing here is a very interesting map. This is all the locations worldwide. This is by month Twitter from January 2012 to December 2014. All the locations that are showing at least 2 or more tweets. So it breaks up the world into a grid, 2 or more tweets a month. And out of the streaming API. And what's really fascinating, so these are kind of the areas that you're seeing high amounts of Twitter usage. And what's fascinating is I used to open so I did a famous study back in 2012, the Global Twitter Heartbeat, which really looked at the geography of Twitter and how that was growing. And what you saw in 2012 was Twitter was expanding exponentially. I mean, it was on track to cover the entire world. And what you see here is so this timeline in the lower left, that's the number of tweets from the streaming API per month. And you see it levels off about middle of 2013. And what you see, if you look closely at the geography, you see kind of this exponential rise. Twitter is just spreading, and then it kind of pauses, and then it kind of re-centralizes internally. This is very important. One of my columns that will be coming out soon from Foreign Policy looks at the Yemeni conflict, so the Yemen-Saudi Arabia conflict, and shows that that's a conflict that we're seeing so much social media coverage about, but it's coming almost exclusively from the Saudi Arabian side. We're really not seeing the Yemeni side of that conflict. And this comes out across the world. What you see are well, wow, look at this. There's a conflict happening here. And I can turn to YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and see everything that's coming out of that. Well, you can see a lot, but you're not, you're missing critical portions of this. So this is really sort of that notion of, we're all sort of very, today things like Twitter, it's the shiny new objects, like, wow, cool, data set, it's got an API, great, plug in and I can generate great things from it. But to sort of caution and say, well, oftentimes, you have to really think about what's the data showing me. This is an interesting map. This is comparing the month of March of this year, all locations mentioned in BBC coverage and all locations mentioned in the New York Times. What's interesting about this, so orange BBC, green New York Times, you can see that there's actually, BBC seems to have a much greater reach in a lot of areas of the world than the New York Times. And you see the New York Times kind of has this flash where it kind of puts everything out based on its old print cycle. BBC, of course, they have somewhat of an unfair advantage simply because they still operate bureaus across the world, whereas the New York Times is sort of retrenched a little bit. And the BBC offers so many different language versions, including now a Thai language version. But what's so fascinating about this is in American academic literature, communications and political science in particular, the New York Times is the outlet that's used to try and catalog the world. And what this suggests is that you're getting a very skewed view of the world. Basically, it's interesting to do visualizations like this because intrinsically you kind of think, well, the New York Times, all the news that's fit to print, we all sort of recognize that there's a lot that isn't in there. But to be able to visualize that and be able to say, well, really you'd need to at least add BBC into here if you're trying to reach, for example, sort of a lot of the eastern part of the world. So its ability to the ability to blank out a screen, it totally froze. There we go. All right. Outsmarted by a USB remote. So anyway, so this is really the goal. So my project is really about, so the GDELT project, which I run, is supported by Google Ideas, is really about how do we try to catalog the world's information. So take the world's open information in 65 languages, live machine translate all of that in real time, and try to extract what's happening around the world, who's involved, the emotions, the themes, the imagery, the context, to try and create essentially a graph over human society. It's a small goal, I know, very small. And really this was kind of prompted by the idea that today, we've got satellites in space and sensors in the ground that can tell you an earthquake anywhere in the world within seconds, and you know all this detail about it. But what if you want to know, tell me every protest happening right now on this earth, every protest worldwide, how many people are involved, what are they protesting about, and how is the public reacting to that? We really haven't had data like that to be able to observe the natural world. But all the pieces are in place. You've got news media in most areas of the world. You have social media now. You have all these data streams that exist. How do we pull those all together? So the GDELT project, you can imagine sort of every moment, second by second, you can imagine essentially scooping up a large fraction, print, broadcast, and web from around the world, this enormous fire hose of media coming in, adding in books and academic literature and all these other things I'll talk about in a second. So you have this massive fire hose of information coming in. Anything that's not English goes over here and gets live machine translated, and I'll come to that in a second. 65 languages, it's the largest deployment of streaming machine translation, where the accuracy is modulated based on how much raw data is coming in. So all this stuff gets translated, and then it processes it, and two things happen. One, it goes through and it tries to understand what physically happened here. So in this particular case, we see an article that tells us, well, two things happened here. Iraq diplomatically criticized Turkey. The reason for that was because Turkey bombed Kurdish militants. So taking that text and trying to understand about 300 categories of what physically happened here. So being able to catalog protests, et cetera. The other side of that then, which I'll come down to, is, okay, so this happened. Well, who's involved? How's the world feeling about it? Is the world saying Iraq was good for criticizing Turkey, or are they saying Turkey's the better party in this? How is the world kind of reacting? How does that vary across the world? So there's 300 million events right now, 300 categories around the world, going back to 79. This is an example of what you can do. You can kind of map out, for example, Nigeria. Each of these little dots is representing some event that took place. And so you can basically make animations forward. The map in the upper right, that was Ukraine just before the president fled. And actually, if you zoom in, it was really interesting. It showed Crimea really turning against. You saw all the pieces in place. In DC, a lot of people were saying, look, the president just signed a peace deal with the protesters. They're already dispersing. Ukraine is now at peace. And I don't think that was an intelligence failure. I think that was politicians seeing the world through rose-colored glasses. But this is very powerful to be able to say, well, look, we've got local media there that's reporting they're pulling all police forces out of neighboring areas and moving into this. The government obviously is believing something bad is about to happen here. They don't believe peace is happening. And so, or vice versa, simply having that much forces entering an area is potentially going to cause some issues. So being able to look at, be able to map things out, be able to do things like this top map. This is actually percentage of events that GDELT monitors from worldwide media that are relating to protests. So sort of a protest intensity. And so you can see around the Arab Spring, you can see sort of ebbs and flows. You can see, well, yes, post-Arab Spring, there are more protests being reported worldwide, but actually this pales in comparison to what we saw in the 80s. The map at the bottom is Ukraine, so it's drilling down and trying to understand protest trends. We've got a piece that will be coming out soon looking at this across Europe and understanding how fragile the EU really is, based on the enormous differences in how the EU societies are used to dealing with societal tension or things like economic hardship. So of course you have this event data, so what's physically happening around the world. But what's often interesting is you just want to know about media coverage, for example. This top graph using the television collection that Roger was talking about. So this is the number of mentions in television news that they monitor about Ebola. And so you can see, for example, that thousands of people are dying in Africa, zero coverage. It wasn't until the WHO says now we have a real crisis here, and just a little blip. It wasn't until the first Americans get it that, oh my God, we're all going to die, and this is actually newsworthy now. And this tells us something really important about, what are Americans thinking about what's happening over there, and then the tone of that, the emotion of that. And this, I can't remember if this was the A&E, I can't remember which dictionary was used for this, but what this shows actually is a slant towards positivity, and actually, as part of one of my FP columns, I actually walked through CNN's coverage over this entire time, every single article in CNN over time, and what you saw was very fascinating, is you saw literally that inflection point there where the news becomes more positive. The first CNN article was, oh my God, it's 99% lethality, it's a death sentence, sentence, if it comes over here, we're all going to die. The whole country's going to die. It'll be the plague. And then what you saw was when those first Americans get it and that miracle cure comes out, then you saw, look, it's modern medicine to the rescue. America is here now. We will save you all. There's nothing to worry about now. And then you saw all this coverage about medicine and all these cures, and Ebola isn't scary anymore. This is really, really fascinating, to be able to see that. Because again, intrinsically, you kind of, if you were watching the news, you kind of sense that. But to be able to actually plot that and see this was the inflection point, and this lines up with when the Americans got it. So really trying to understand, what are we really seeing in the news? What is the news really telling us? This was a piece kind of looking at structure. So this, my father is one of the future gen scientists. So carbon sequestration, clean energy, and so on. So one of the things we did is we looked at 5 years of English language coverage of carbon sequestration, pulled out all the people names and who's appearing with whom. And it turns out this cluster is very interesting, these communities. And in particular, what you're seeing is sort of basically what names co-occur with what names in news coverage. And a lot of it all makes sense, but what's very interesting is around the fringes of each of them, you see the reporters and the analysts that are involved, like the Wall Street analysts. So you start kind of understanding where, for example, relating to, say, the British conservative view on carbon sequestration, the political party, who are the reporters that are primarily the ones that are covering that sector? So you really start understanding where are the viewpoints that people are seeing, who are sort of the gatekeepers to how people understand these various sectors of things. And then this was the piece I did for FP. This was most of 2013, all the names extracted out and put in a giant graph. This is the top 100,000 names. And this is more wall art than science, this particular graph, because there's so much there. But what's interesting is you actually zoom in, you start seeing really interesting connectivity about how countries are connected. You can actually, some of the countries, you can actually trace out their military hierarchy because you see what names co-occur with the president and then on downwards. So you see really, really fascinating things that being able to look at the world at scale. This was a single day of global coverage of the Mexican drug cartels. What are all the locations that are mentioned alongside the Mexican drug cartels? Turns out the day that this news media was from, this actually matched DEA's own maps very, very closely. You see the transit corridors and everything. So again, kind of a very powerful way to say, well, what's the geographic footprint and that we see in the media, and does this reflect the known reality of this? This is a very interesting study with IRIN. This is media fatigue. So this is basically, it's a normalized Z-scale, but this is basically the Nepal earthquake and then the Vanuatu typhoon. What you saw here is basically sort of intensity of coverage. So you see very low coverage, it shoots up, and then you see it basically, in Nepal, Vanuatu, you see a larger shoot up. And because again, you knew that was coming down the road. But what you see is very fascinating is you see that really within a single week, you've lost most of that interest of coverage, and within 2 weeks, you've pretty much lost the interest. And what's interesting is this actually now, it turns out this particular, this exact timeline follows from many, many disasters that we've looked at. And again, people in journalism understand media fatigue, but being able to map that precisely, what's most interesting is this bottom graph. This actually looks at the domestic media by country and shows that graph actually follows across countries. So even countries that are nearby, they're not covering it longer. It's basically sort of a fixed cycle. So this really tells you with things like natural disasters, you have a very, very short window where people actually hear. You think about Haiti. What's the latest that's from the 2010 earthquake? What's the latest in Haiti today? How are things going? How is rebuilding going in each part of the country? Most people don't know because the media has long ago forgotten about Haiti. So sentiment analysis. So the question, of course, is, what is the sentiment? People always want to know tone about things. And of course, as Roger was pointing out, that's a huge issue. I mean, sarcasm, especially different parts of the world, symbolism, and all these things mean different things. So the goal here is to say, well, what if we take, all of the major, so right now over 24, I think this is actually now up to 28 or 29 now, basically take every open dictionary or dictionary that I can get permission to use, and basically apply them all. So right now, over 4,500 emotions and themes are coded from every single article. The goal is to basically say, what if we take every sentiment dictionary that's out there and run every article through all of those? Then we can start understanding, well, do some of these seem to reflect more? Because what you see is they tend to line up in certain areas and then they diverge in other areas. So the ability for the first time to actually see this. The literature is split. About half the literature says translation. If you translate a document, say from Arabic into English and run it through an English dictionary, that is not meaningful. That loses the emotion. Another portion of literature says absolutely total preservation, no change at all. There just hasn't been much work at this. So what happens if we basically try this? What can we see from this? So every article, you have everything from anxiety to smugness. So these aren't just positive, negative. These are all, because psychologists, they don't talk about positive, negative. They talk about all these hedonic signals and all these things. So trying to run it through all these different dictionaries, and also foreign language dictionaries. So things like ML Senecon, which is aimed for the Spanish languages, the Spanish adaptation of ANU. So the idea is to say, well, what happens if we, especially if we have dictionaries that are based for a language, What if we take a Spanish document, run it through Spanish anew, and then we run it through the English anew, the base one? Do we see identical? How much is translation affecting us? And does that affect us more in certain areas than others? So kind of building a base that we can understand emotion through this. This was the television archive plotting. This is through positivity. This is the anxiety from Regressive Imagery Dictionary. And you can see all the way there that towards the end, that huge jump, that was the government shutdown. So of course, the huge fear that, my God, the government shutting down. This is an interesting one. So this is Assad of Syria, and what you're seeing is positivity, negativity here. It turns out if you actually kind of trace this out, these ups and downs actually follow quite closely. What's interesting is they actually slightly lead his behavior. So you see if tone is collapsing, just after that tends to be when he tends to do things. Now, that's not reflecting the fact that he's watching the news media and saying, God, everyone's upset with me, now I should do something. It's reflecting that the news media is capturing the fact that he's being boxed into a corner here, and then he wins, and the next thing happens. So it's very interesting if we try to start playing out the correlations of this with behavior. The mass translation. So right now, 65 languages represents 98.4% of what we see worldwide. This is dealing with slang, alternative names. These are all the languages here. Obviously, quality of things like Russian. Philip Krohn, who's one of the fathers of Moses, which is one of the big toolkits. We use his Russian engine by permission. Obviously, that's a lot more accurate than, say, Swahili, where there simply are very, very few resources that are available for that. So again, though, the goal is what happens when we translate all this stuff. You see wildly different views. So this is blue. So this is Yemen. Blue is English. Red are what's being discussed in Arabic language press. And you see, there are some similarities in major areas, but a huge difference there as well. And in fact, this is from a particular day. Now, if you actually roll forward more recently, the checkpoints, a lot of the death squads that are occurring are exclusively being reported in Arabic language press. The American or English language press, even BBC, are not really reaching into those areas. So of course, the news media is only one element of things. So what happens if we take, for example, Amnesty International, their entirety of their publications back to 1960, put that in a map, and we see the geographic footprint. We can drill into here and say, well, where's a particular torture mechanism used, or what's kind of known from these, basically sort of, because the news tells us what's happening, not why it's happening. This is an academic literature project. This is collaboration with the US Army. JSTOR, with permission of JSTOR, we're able to process the entirety of their holdings back to 1945. Of academic literature of all the major social science and humanities journals, DTIC, and then of course the Internet Archive. There are 1.7 billion PDFs. Scan the URLs of those for things that look like academic literature, then anything that was still living, process that. What you're seeing here is the geographic footprint of these. And what's interesting is we can take topics like food security and actually map that through and say, what are all the locations that are discussed in the academic literature about food security? And scholars can look at this and say, well, yes, and they say, well, boy, no one's really talked about food security in this area. This is an area that we know is a problem, but no one's really talked about in that area. And then you can drill down to the citation graph and say, who's the most heavily cited? Who's an expert? So the reason the Army is interested in this is this is the nation-building arm of the Army. They actually build schools and does other things. So they can go in and say, for example, we want to build a school here. The geology is great, but what are the social cultural issues here? Is this an area where women and men are not allowed to be educated? Is a certain area, is this tribe not allowed to cross over this border? So this is the ability, you think about one of the challenges is that social cultural issues, here in the US, we have a separation of church and state. We have a lot of these separations. A lot of parts of the world, cultural, ethnic, religious connections have intense impact, and that's very foreign to a lot of Western analysts. So being able to, it's not that no one's ever known anything. These areas have been enormously well studied. They have their own incredible literatures, and historically we've not sort of looked at this. So what happens when we process all this material? Be able to look at all these different things. Another project, UN OSHA, Standby Task Force, QCRI, and some others. Every time a natural disaster occurs worldwide, when the UN declares that as a disaster, immediately we begin a feed of everything that we see worldwide about that disaster. We provide a feed, including all the imagery that's in all this coverage. Right now, humans then go through and manually tag all that imagery. Right now, we've been partnering with MetaMind, very interested in talking with Wolfram as well. How do we take all that imagery and be able to say, this is an image of President Obama saying what a terrible tragedy versus this is an image of a building down. And specifically, being able to detect, for example, what is the level of damage that we're seeing there. Being able to map out in real time, this is a project with the U.S. Institute of Peace, what's happening around the world. Be able to literally put images on the map and be able to show networks of connectivity, what's happening anywhere on the planet right now. This is a map that will be coming out soon, tracking global refugee shipment, or the global refugee movement through news media, and did another piece on wildlife crime. So all the things that can be done from this, and I won't touch too much on this, but forecasting can be very interesting. thing. This is a very, very simple example of this. Took Ukraine, right before the president fled, took basically, made essentially a timeline of unrest, looked across the last 30 years from every country, what are all the periods in the last 30 years from any country that are most similar, overlaid those, and then said, well, after each of those periods in the past, what happened after each of those periods? Average those together, and you actually get something correlates at about 0.49. So red is what actually happened in Ukraine, green is what happened in Turkey in this period, and in Lebanon. Average those two together. It's not a perfect match, but you actually get some really interesting up-down behaviors here. And so this is a really fascinating way of kind of saying, you know, are there cycles of world history? And again, this is a very primitive, simple example using Pearson correlations. But what are all the things that we can learn from all this data? And as a simple example, so something that'll be announced shortly. Working with the Internet Archive, we've taken all the Internet Archive's digital book collection, which is an incredible collection. All these amazing books, 1.5 million English language Americana books from 1800 to 1923. And right now, these are all separate PDFs just sitting in this archive. So what we've done now is we're pulling all those in and processing all those, extracting out the people, organizations, locations, themes, emotions, et cetera, and putting all those in the Google BigQuery database platform. So you can literally do a single query and search across all that. This is a very simple one. This is 1800. All the locations mentioned in these books in the year 1800. Here's 1860. And here's 1899. So we can see the Western expansion. You can see what's interesting. You can then topically orient that and say, well, what were people talking about with respect to each of these locations? And then this is me. And if you go to gdeltproject.org, you can see a lot more about this work. Yeah, well, thank you very much.